So this video is going to be a little bit different than our normal videos because until now I've been recording using Kaltura Capture and then uploading our videos to Canvas. And Kaltura is basically a program that's already integrated with Canvas for us to use at LTU. But since Kaltura has been crashing, I'm going to be trying to make some of our videos and posting them on YouTube, so doing things a little bit differently. So hopefully you don't notice too much of a difference. If you have any issues with any of our future videos, let me know and I'll just make sure that you can get access to our main notes here. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Franz Kafka and his short story, The Metamorphosis. The Metamorphosis is also sometimes billed as a novella, so that's why I've italicized it here. So if you italicize it or put it in quotes in the future, if you're writing about it, either way is okay. It kind of does both. It's a little bit long for a short story, so that's why we'd call it a novella, but too short for a normal full novel. So that's why, again, in quotes or italics, either one's going to be okay when you're referring to it, when you're writing to it. Kafka is going to be our author that bridges realism and surrealism. And we talked last week about realism, how we had authors and artists who were depicting scenes from real life, just everyday people going about doing everyday kind of normal things. And when we get to surrealism, we have writers and artists who take that as inspiration and then start to kind of twist their stories. So we have elements that are somewhat bizarre or Kafkaesque. And that term Kafkaesque is going to be explained in one of our videos in the module. It's a term that comes from our author, Franz Kafka. He didn't come up with it, but it's a word that people have used to describe his work because he has a lot of stories where we start off in the everyday kind of normal world and then things start to get strange. So this is the type of thing where if you've seen like the Twilight Zone, we have a little bit of inspiration for that type of thing happening where again, we're in the kind of normal world and then things get strange in order for our readers and audience in general to interact with scenes that are kind of strange but represent things that are happening in their normal lives anyway. So a little bit of a veil there to make it easier for people to grapple with these topics. So going on now to a little bit of background on Franz Kafka, our author. He was born in 1883. He was born in Prague. At the time, the territory belonged to Austria-Hungary and then would later become part of the Czech Republic. His family was Jewish, but Kafka considered himself an atheist. So we see that movement away from religion in some of his personal writings that we have. Kafka's strained relationship with his father influenced a lot of his short stories. So he wrote a lot of stories where he has a main character who's trying to deal with a kind of broken relationship with a parent, usually a father. And in real life, Kafka did try and fix his relationship with his father, but it was somewhat unsuccessful. One of these attempts was that he wrote a letter. And some of you may have heard of a therapeutic exercise where people write a letter to someone that they're having trouble with and kind of say things that they couldn't say aloud in conversation. And they just write out the letter, get it out of their system, and then maybe don't actually share the letter. Maybe it's something that's a little bit harsh. Well, Kafka wrote this letter and did want to give it to his father. He passed it to his mother, and his mother basically said, nope, this is awkward, and I'm not going to share it, and didn't give it to his father. So unfortunately, they never reconciled, never really fixed that relationship, but it motivated Kafka to write these short stories to kind of deal with those emotions and get them out there. During his lifetime, Kafka didn't really have a successful writing career. He didn't really live that long. After his death, some of his unfinished drafts were found and then published. So there were a few pieces that were published during his life, so some people did get to read his work. But again, after his death, people found more of his work, put it out there, published it, and he gained a new, or audiences gained a new appreciation for him. And then he contracted tuberculosis in 1917, and he lived with it for a few years, but he passed in 1924. So again, didn't live that long. That's part of why his career probably didn't take off. Maybe if he would have gained a little bit of confidence later on in life, he would have been able to publish more of these works. So really, in the literary community, we're just kind of thankful that we have some of his works, that people found it and gave him some posthumous appreciation, a little bit more respect later on. So getting into the story, The Metamorphosis, and you can see I've italicized it here. If you want to have it in quotes, if you're writing about it, that's okay too. Again, this is a text that kind of bridges the gap between a short story and a novella because of its length. It's kind of in this weird space. In the story, Gregor is a traveling salesman who awakes one morning to find that he has undergone a transformation. And this is the part that starts us with one foot in realism, and then he really quickly transforms into this insect, where we realize he's woken up as an insect, and that's what puts us into the surrealism territory. So based on the description we have in the story, it's believed that he has turned into an insect, but you may have noticed from footnotes, or if you've looked up anything about the story, that we never really find out what he's transformed into. So a lot of students will picture that Gregor is a cockroach. That's kind of the popular perspective of him. Or people will think that maybe something like an ant. So if you pictured either of those insects or something else, that's okay. We don't actually get a clear translation of what he is. In the original, Kafka described him as an unclean animal unfit for sacrifice, which could be a lot of things. Different cultures and different religions have different ideas of which animals they can and cannot sacrifice, so there's a lot of room for interpretation there. So again, if you pictured him as a cockroach or an ant, that's fine. If you want to picture some other kind of bug or creature, you can do that as well. In this text, Kafka's kind of leaving it to the reader to come up with an interpretation. So unlike some of the other texts we've read, things aren't going to be as clear cut. The reader gets to project a little bit onto the text. Now, kind of along with that here, the reason for Gregor's transformation is never explained, so we never find out what happened. Some readers may think that this is a bit of science fiction, that he's transformed into a bug by some accident. Some people may see this as being magical, that's some sort of magic transformation. Others may view this as some sort of strange karma, that he's done something that's led to him being transformed into a bug. But again, we never really find out, and this is just a chance for the reader to kind of guess, to kind of create their own ending or their own part of the story in a way. Now, as we go through the story, Gregor's relationship with his family deteriorates. And part of this is because of the financial strain the family is put under because of what's going on here. And they also use this as an excuse for their behavior. So his family becomes increasingly cruel to him as the story goes on. His father becomes downright abusive to him. So again, we see Kafka using this as a way to kind of deal with his own family trauma through the story here. Now, if you were a little bit confused about what's happening with the family's finances in the story, we can talk about that for a second here. So there's been a mistake made by the father that's led to the family not having the greatest situation, and that's part of why Gregor has to work to provide for them. We should note that Gregor is an adult in this story, so he could move out on his own. That wouldn't be too culturally unusual for this time. So he could have his job and move out, but instead he chose to stay with the family. When we look at what his sister's doing, his sister is younger, so for this time and culture, it wouldn't be unusual for her as an unmarried woman to still be living at home. But again, for Gregor, he could have moved out at this point, so he's staying with his family to provide for them. He feels that that's his duty. When Gregor is no longer able to do that because of the transformation, then his father reassumes the role of the head of the family and goes out and gets a job, and then his sister also goes out too. So he kind of pushes the family to change what they've been doing, but the family then resents him for this. So we have some role reversals happening a couple times in the story. We first have Gregor providing, even though he's still the child of his parents, obviously, providing for his parents, and then we have the switch where his father has to take back over and provide for them again. And for both of these people, their identity is tied very closely to their job, each of them being at some point almost the patriarch of the family, Gregor as the younger not really being able to assume that fully here. And then at the end, Gregor dies, never having regained his human form. This is again a point that for some readers is bothersome. Why don't we know what happened to him? Why does he just kind of have to die without us knowing why the transformation happened? But this is going back to the realism part of the story, that a lot of our realist authors would have something like a death rather sad at the end of their story to kind of remind people of the human condition, that everyone meets the same fate regardless of their social class or any other factors in their lives. So going on here to motifs and symbols in the story, this is not an exhaustive list, so there are other motifs and symbols. I hope you look for some other ones in the reading, but we'll just touch on a few of them here. So we have class identity, family, and duty as our motifs or our recurring ideas. And these are going to be very common motifs in a lot of realist stories and some surrealist stories as well. And you may see class identity, family, and duty tying back to the readings that we had last week with punishment and Kabbalawala. Now, with each of these motifs, we can also think of their relationship to each of our characters. So where do the characters get their sense of identity from, specifically their class identity? Where do they get their ideas about family from? So we have, for the most part, most of our characters are part of a nuclear family. Later on, we have a few characters who are renters or boarders who come to live with the family for a time, and a housekeeper as well. But we mainly have a nuclear family, so a mother, father, and children, and we see that Gregor's relationship with them starts to change over the course of the story. So initially, his family is concerned about him, or they seem concerned because he can't leave his room, and then later on, they start to get more and more agitated and disgusted with him. And his sister shows sympathy for him for a while. She's the one who brings him food, cares for him, and eventually even she kind of breaks that tie with him. And his parents are also kind of fairly quick to break that bond and abandon him. So a very strained relationship here, again, somewhat reflective of what Kafka was dealing with here, feeling that abandonment from his parents, trying to work through that a little bit in the story. And then we also have duty. So duty to family being a big point here, a little bit less perhaps duty to one's own identity. So we have Gregor in some small ways trying to assert who he is, but he's also very concerned about his family and what's happening to them throughout the story. His family's sense of duty also changes at different times. So their duty to each other, as we see them feed Gregor and then slowly stop doing that. And then their duty to their sense of self increases later in the story as they become a little bit more selfish, as many readers would interpret it, as they think about what's going to happen to them, how they can move out of the house, and so forth. So duty being a good thing and a bad thing in some cases in the story. Going on here, we have some symbols. And again, this is not the whole list of symbols that are in this story. I do hope you try and think of some other ones as you go back through. But some really easy examples for you to find here are going to be food, doors and windows, and the picture in Gregor's room. You could also think of the walls and other house spaces too. So when we look at food here, we'll notice in the story that Gregor's tastes start to change as he starts to kind of embrace what he's transformed into. So initially when he's hungry, he likes things that are kind of more standard human foods, and then later on he wants things that are rotten. He wants things that we would see as gross, but that an animal like an insect would still happily eat. So his tastes change as he goes from kind of abhorring and being afraid of what he's become to accepting it. And then we also have food seen as a weapon. So his father throws the apple at him and hurts him. So we also have this thing that normally is a symbol of something that nourishes us, and also a symbol of family. If you think about people having a meal with their family, it's something that connects us. We're very kind of vulnerable in a way when we're eating. And then it becomes this symbol of violence from his father. So we've got this kind of turning of the symbol into something unusual that's different from what we would expect when hearing about food. Going on, we can think of doors, windows, and like I said, walls as well. So how Gregor interacts with rooms is going to change. As he again keeps moving towards and embracing his new form, he starts to see rooms differently. Again, he spends much of the story in his own room, and then he interacts with the furniture differently as the story goes on too. So we can think of how things change a little bit with that, how our perceptions of what a room is can be different depending on the character who's in that room, which can seem like a very, again, normal, mundane thing that of course our characters might be in a house at some point. But as you go back through, think of how Gregor interacts with his furniture, with his room, how he sees that space. And this is actually an idea that's going to come up in one of our later stories too, the symbolism behind doors and windows and home spaces. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind for one of our last readings. And then we also have the picture in Gregor's room. So Gregor has a picture of a woman in his room. You could think of this as kind of being like a pinup model, this kind of fancy lady. And she's representing what he would like to have, that he would like to have money, success, maybe a wife, something like that in his life. So we don't want to hypersexualize the picture. Gregor's not having a bunch of posters or anything, going kind of women crazy, but she's again representing this life that he wishes he could have down the line, that he's been working very hard for his family and providing for them and hasn't really shaped his own social life. He goes to work and comes home. So this is kind of his window into what he could have if he gets beyond this. So we're going to wrap up our discussion of Kafka there. There's also a worksheet in the module that I'd like you to take a look at. And what you're going to do with the worksheet is see a question, and the question will be in the very far left column. And that's going to be related to an idea that's put forward in Kafka's writing. Some of them will be a little bit depressing, so I don't want you to think that these are statements of fact, that these are truths for all of our surrealist or realist writers, but they're just concepts that come up in Kafka's writing. So go ahead and look at the question, the idea, and you're going to find a quote that goes along with it from the text. So where do we see this idea coming up, and explaining it with a quote, and then explaining a little bit more how you interpret it. And then we'll also have another category for seeing how that idea comes up in the world today. So making connections between our quotes. And part of why this exercise is important to do is because sometimes when we're working on a paper and we find quotes, we think that our reader's automatically going to know why we're using this quote, that the quote speaks for itself. But quotes don't always really do that. Sometimes we need to explain why a quote's important, what the author's trying to say to us, because different people can interpret different quotes the same way, the different ideas in a slightly different way. All right, so that's going to wrap up our video here. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about the reading, please let me know. If there's anything you're confused about, again, really important to let me know, since I won't know if you're confused unless you tell me or if I see it on a paper. So let me know before we get to that point. And we are going to have a pretty short week of videos this week of these lectures, because we do have our next paper that's due on the 3rd. So it's due earlier than it normally would be, due earlier in the week, because we've got a holiday weekend coming up. So again, make sure you're working on that paper, and let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I have had a few students book appointments to talk with me in Zoom about the paper. So if you haven't done that yet, but you're thinking you might need some help or some feedback, make sure that you get in touch with me so we can set up that Zoom meeting or just an email. And you're also, of course, welcome to talk to a tutor from the AAC or the Horrell Writing Center as well. Again, just to make sure you've got another pair of eyes on your paper. I would advise against showing fellow classmates your paper, just because because sometimes students read each other's work and they'll hear or see kind of a good idea and think, oh, I can incorporate that in my paper too. But then we start to get into plagiarism territory where people's papers look very similar because you've come up with the same idea for how to outline your paper. So just be careful of that. It is okay to have other people read your paper to give you feedback, but just make sure you're not overlapping things too much with your buddy and how he or she writes their paper. All right, again, and I know I say this a lot, any questions, comments, or concerns, do please let me know. Email, Canvas, message, whatever you want to do, so we can make sure that you're feeling good in our short week here. Have a good rest of your day.